Something that I've seen on the internet is wedding photographers looking for that next lens to add to their equipment list. So today I'm comparing three lenses that I regularly use at weddings. The RF 85mm 1.4 VCM, the RF 100mm L macro lens, and the Canon 7200mm f2.8 Z lens. By looking at these three lenses, we can see which one fits your budget and your shooting style. Going straight in, we're going to start talking about your budget. Budgets vary from person to person, but making this investment is worth some considerable thought because all three of these lenses combined are about $8,200 Canadian. Remember that. I'm up in Canada. Starting with the RF 85mm 1.4 VCM lens, this lens comes in at $2,100 Canadian. Now, if you really are on a stretch, you could get the f2 for sub $1,000, or if you really want to spend a lot of money, you can get the 1.2 version at $3,900 Canadian. However, I love the 1.4 version because it is lighter than 1.2 and it is weather sealed and optically better than the f2 version. Next up on our hit list, we have the Canon RF 100mm L macro lens. This lens comes in at $1,800, so it is a sub $2,000 lens, which is great for those that really can't go past $2,000. And lastly, we are looking at the RF 7200mm Z lens. This lens is the internal zooming version. You can get the external version, the external zooming version, for $500 cheaper. However, if you're already spending that much, I recommend just stretching a little further and getting the internal zooming lens. Now, because this is a $4,300 lens and you're already considering an 85mm lens, if you personally might even be considering the 85-1.2, which is $3,900, or the 7200mm lens. Because these lenses are all very expensive, you also have to think about your return on investment. Now, I use these three lenses for very different things, and I can justify being a business using these lenses. And if you're just starting out, it's really worth considering where you put your money first. Starting with the RF 85mm 1.4 VCM lens. This lens is a fantastic little lens. It's wonderful and small. It has a really nice damped manual focus ring. It has the custom control dial, and it has the D-clicked aperture control ring for video or photo in newer camera models only. It also has the custom function button on the side and an AF to MF switch. Who is this lens really for? So if you're using a 24-70 or a 15-35 and you want something that really defines your portraits and you do a lot of portraits, the 85mm 1.4 is wonderful for that. It will make your portfolio really shine for those intimate portraits or even full body portraits at a distance, because you will get that 85mm compression. It is great for low light indoor ceremonies and receptions. So for tighter receptions and smaller ceremonies, I love the 85mm because it's not too long, it is lovely. You can use it at f2 with flash inside and get wonderful portraits. It is great for candid moments of guests, the couple, and it also really shines in natural low light environments. You can do some really tight, intimate shots in low light without flash and create some dramatic portraits. The autofocus on these VCM lenses is phenomenal. Like, I love the autofocus in this lens. Some of the places where this lens doesn't shine as well is when you shoot directly into the sun, you get harsher flares within the lens. However, I believe it's a fantastic trade-off for that, being that this lens is this small. It doesn't hurt your back at the end of 8-10 hours. Like, I love it for that. Now, being a fixed prime lens, you will have to move your feet, which to me personally, I don't find that too much of a problem unless you're in a church where you're stuck at the back and you can't do anything. You can't get up close to the couple. So that's where you would probably want a zoom lens. Next up on our hit list, the RF 100mm L macro lens. This lens has a nice damped manual focus ring as well, standard with all RF lenses of the L variety. It has the clicked custom control wheel. This lens, unlike the RF 85mm 1.4 VCM lens, is optically stabilized. Unlike the other two lenses that we're looking at today, it does have an SA control ring. Me personally, I haven't used the SA control ring for work. I have experimented with it a little. And I find if you go beyond more than just one increment, it's too much for me. Now, because it is a macro lens, you do have a focus limiter switch. So if you are using this outside of macro work, you can limit your focus distance, especially if you're doing portraits and such. What this lens is really great for, and I use it a lot personally, is those detail shots, invitations, wedding rings, jewelry, some dress details are the options that I really use this lens that I don't use any other lens for. Other scenarios where you can use this lens, it does have a fast autofocus system. It is not quite as fast as the 85mm VCM lens or the 70-200 L series lens, but it is still good enough. It will produce some wonderful portraits that have some really nice separation and background blur. So if you're really torn between this or the 85 VCM lens, it's really a question on what you prioritize more, whether you're a second shooter or a primary shooter, and if you want those up close details. Now, if you're a second shooter and you do have this lens and you are at the back of wedding ceremonies, using it with a higher megapixel camera like a Canon R5 or the R5 II will give you some cropping ability. However, using it on a camera like the R6, cropping in too much could be detrimental to images, especially if you want to blow them up big or the client wants to blow them up big. But this is a great lens for that. I have seen first shooters, so primary wedding photographers, use this as their long lens. So they would have like a 24-70, and then they would have this lens too, because you can, if you can't walk as close to the couple, or you won't have to get as close to the couple as you would with an 85 to get like the ring exchange pictures. Things where I'd say this lens is not best suited for is for those tighter indoor wedding ceremonies and receptions, especially if it's in a small space. You may find 100mm just that little bit too long, where you can't get like someone standing at the head table giving a speech. There won't be any breathing room in the picture, especially if it's like a smaller room and you're 10-15 feet away, not even that. So being in those tighter spaces, I wouldn't recommend this lens for that. However, if you really can't go past $2,000, you're going to be very happy with this lens. But using it inside, even at 2.8, like with my 85, because I want to balance my light really nicely, I'll shoot at f2 on my 85 or 2.8 if you're using this lens, and use a flash too. that's just the way I shoot. I use speed lights. But if you're a natural light shooter and you're shooting indoors, 2.8, even though they are considered low light lenses, 2.8 might just be a little bit too narrow for you to use in those scenarios. And lastly, we have the Canon RF 70 to 200 millimeter L Z lens. This lens is probably your most versatile out of the bunch. This lens comes with a super small zoom throw on it, so it makes changing your focal length just like you can only move your thumb just a little bit. It's almost like a 90 degrees of movement. You have a really nice manual focus ring. Again, you have the custom control ring, like the 85 millimeter 1.4 VCM lens. You do have a D-clicked aperture control ring for video and photo on select camera models. You also have two custom function buttons. Both those buttons do the same thing. You just select what you want it from the menu. And you have a range of buttons. You have the choice of 3 stabilizer modes, because this lens does have optical stabilization. So you have modes 1, 2, 3. 1 is for stabilizing your lens all the time, 2 is for panning, and 3 is for optically stabilizing the image whilst you're taking exposure. This is the option I use because then I'm not draining my battery power as fast. You have the option to turn your stabilizer on and off like any other optically stabilized lens, AF to MF switch, and you have a focus limiter switch. This lens is weather sealed. It is internally zooming, so I personally think this lens is better weather sealed than the external zooming version, the 2470 and the 15 to 35. Out of the Holy Trinity lenses, this one is probably sealed the best. You will find that this lens is much sharper when you compare it to the RF 100mm L macro lens. Even at longer focal lengths, this lens is very sharp. This lens is fantastic for those outdoor wedding ceremonies. You can get, your close-up details. If the bride's walking a long way, has a long path to the ceremony, you can get pictures of her coming in, wide, tight shots, and then you can pan around once she gets closer with a 2470. I have used this lens for speeches. Well, not this particular lens, but this focal length for speeches inside with flash as a second shooter, and I find it's pretty great for that. As a primary shooter, I tend to go with an 85, my 85mm for those types of events. However, if it is a really big indoor space, a 70 to 200mm is going to be very nice. Things that really go against this lens, I mean, it has a the lens foot, you can't take it off. I mean, you can slide it off, but you can't take this piece off. That's my part that I dislike the most about this lens. I just kind of flick it up out the way. And it is heavier than the other two lenses we have talked about today. But if you're comparing this lens to older versions or third-party EF mount versions, this lens, when you compare it directly to those lenses, this lens is extremely light. Hence, I use it without the foot. So who is this lens really for? I mean, if you're a secondary shooter, this lens is going to be very great. And it's going to stand you apart from other second shooters because you're going to be able to get closer in details than other second shooters. So I recommend this to people that, or even, photographers that only do second shooting. This is going to be a very, very good lens. And I found that I use this lens more second shooting than I did as a primary photographer. However, on those outdoor large wedding ceremonies, this lens is on my camera for the whole ceremony, and I wouldn't be without it. So it's one of those lenses that it's expensive, doesn't get a whole lot of use, but it really sets you apart. My personal recommendations out of these three lenses, well, the 85 will really set your portraits apart from your other pictures. If you already have a portrait lens, then the 100mm will give those clients those extra shots, those detail shots that they will treasure. And if you're shooting weddings on a regular basis, especially outdoor or indoor ceremonies that are large enough that you can use flash, or churches, then the 7200mm will earn its keep, even though you only use it for maybe 30 minutes to an hour of your 8 to 10 hour workday. Personally, I find that the 85mm is my most used lens out of all three of them. I will use it for bride and groom prep type portraits. I will use it for the bride and groom and them separately, and their close portraits, or the bride and groom further away. I will use this for the 100mm. I pretty much explicitly bring it out just for those tight detail shots, so it gets probably even less use than the 70-200 personally, if I'm honest, 20-30 minutes. But it gets those images that you can put in a wedding album, and the client's going to love those. They'll be like, oh, look, there's my wedding ring, and it's polished. Like after 10 years, you clean your jewelry yearly, hopefully. If not, then, jewelry fades, and clients will see their wedding invitations and their bright, shiny new jewelry in their wedding album in, large in print, or, depending on the size of their album, but, it will get you those treasure shots. And the 70-200, like I said, it's fantastic for those outdoor ceremonies, churches, and really large venues where you can, if the parents are on one side of the room and the bride and groom are doing speeches on the other side, and it's a big distance, then this is going to be fantastic for that also. So circling back round to budget, if you only had $2,000, or if I only had $2,000, I would go and push myself $2,100 and get the 85mm first. Because this isn't going to be your only lens, right? You're going to have other lenses, so you can have like a 35, and you might have a 35 macro, but even with a 35, you can get some really, like the VCM version, you can get some nice close-up detail shots, not as big, close-up as the 100, but it's, this is the lens that I would get first. Now, if I had $4,000 to spend, or $4,300, which lens would I get? Well, it wouldn't be the 85 1.2, because I'd be getting this lens. Or if you don't do a lot of big ceremonies and you do a lot of portraiture, then I would buy both the 100 and the 85mm lenses that we talked about today. Okay, guys, I've got to dash out the house, so I really hope you guys have loved this video. My name is Tim Gowling. I'm a wedding and lifestyle photographer based out of Eastern Ontario, and have a good one.